Tonight, we're going somewhere older than pyramids, older than Cleopatra, older even than the word history itself. You've just opened your eyes in ancient Egypt. Don't picture Hollywood's shiny golden palaces or those neat little hieroglyphics we all doodled in school notebooks. No, what's waiting for you is the real Nile Valley, dusty, hot, buzzing with insects and ruled by gods you've never heard of, but who, according to everyone around you, are already very, very angry at you. You might think, hey, I can handle a little sand and sunshine, but trust me, the sun doesn't just shine here. It hammers you, cooks you slowly from the moment RA rises over the horizon. Your lips crack, your water jar is already empty, and you've only been awake for 10 minutes. Congratulations, you've survived breakfast. Now, before we take another step into this ancient world, I'll ask you for a small favor. If this kind of slow, winding journey helps you drift off, or just distracts you from your own noisy modern brain, feel free to like the video, maybe subscribe, but only if it genuinely makes your night easier. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love imagining the strange global campfire we've built together, people in every time zone, falling asleep to the same dusty, boring but strange stories. So dim your lights, maybe turn on a fan, or let the quiet crackle of a fireplace keep you company. Settle in, because tonight you're about to discover why you wouldn't last a single day in ancient Egypt. You wake up to the sound of flies. Not birds, not a pleasant morning song, just flies, a dozen of them, orbiting lazily around your face like tiny, buzzing planets, as if you're the center of some unpleasant solar system. Your bed, or what passes for one, is nothing more than a thin mat made from reeds, laid over a floor that hasn't been swept since, well, ever. The mat smells faintly of the Nile, which is a nice poetic way of saying it smells like mud, fish, and yesterday's heat. Your back aches. Of course it does. There's no pillow here, just a crumpled piece of cloth stuffed with more reeds. You shift a little and immediately regret it, because the reeds poke you through the thin fabric like an army of tiny spears. Congratulations, you've survived the night. Barely. The first thing you notice is the air. Heavy. Thick. It's not even noon yet, and already it feels like you're breathing through a damp wool blanket. The desert sun doesn't rise gently here. It leaps into the sky and then dares you to keep living under it. You think you're tough, but within 10 minutes you're already sweating. The kind of sweat that makes you stick to your own clothes. And let's talk about those clothes. Forget crisp linen robes from the movies. What you've got is more like a hand-me-down sheet. Rough, scratchy, and probably not washed since the last time the Nile flooded. Which, by the way, is once a year. You pull it around yourself anyway, because modesty is important in ancient Egypt, even when you're about to keel over from the heat. Somewhere outside, you hear the bray of a donkey, children shouting, a woman carrying a jug bigger than her head, balancing it with one hand as if physics simply worked differently back then. Meanwhile, you're just trying to stand up without falling over. Congratulations, you've managed to get out of bed. It's only been 5 minutes into your ancient Egyptian morning, and already survival feels optional. So you're awake. Congratulations again. But now comes the real challenge. Breakfast. In the movies, people always imagine ancient Egypt as this land of golden feasts, pyramids, and endless trays of grapes. But in reality, breakfast here is, how should we put this, humble If you're lucky, and I mean really lucky, someone has baked bread this morning. Not the fluffy kind you're picturing, with a soft crust and a warm, yeasty smell. No, this bread is flat, heavy, and hard enough to chip a tooth. It's made from barley or emmer wheat, ground into flour between stone tools, which sounds fine until you realize that little bits of stone from the grinding process often ended up in the flour. So yes, you're starting your day chewing on rocks. Dental work doesn't exist yet, so your teeth are going to hate you for this. And what are you drinking with this crunchy rock bread? Beer. Yes, beer. But not the golden, frothy kind you'd proudly pour into a glass today. This is more like a gritty, sour porridge that just happens to contain alcohol. Think of it as liquid bread. Thick, cloudy, and filled with floating lumps that you'd rather not identify. People drank it every day because water wasn't always safe. So congratulations, you're washing down stone bread with lumpy beer. Bon appetit. Now, if you happen to be lower on the social ladder, and let's face it, you probably are, your meal might just be onions or leeks. That's it. Raw, sharp, pungent onions. Imagine starting your day by crunching into a fist-sized onion like it's an apple. Everyone around you is doing it, so at least you'll all smell equally terrible together. Meanwhile, the sun is already climbing higher, turning the mud brick walls of your house into a kind of oven. You've barely eaten, and yet the sweat is back, dripping down your forehead, stinging your eyes. You think about going back to bed, but remember the reeds, the flies, and the poking spears disguised as a mattress. Nope, staying awake it is. Breakfast is over. You've survived it, somehow. But don't get too comfortable. You still have a full ancient Egyptian day ahead. And spoiler alert, it only gets harder from here. So you've survived your onion-flavored breakfast. Congratulations. Now it's time to face the real meat of the day, work. And here's the thing. Unless you're a high priest or part of the royal family, your career options are not very glamorous. In fact, you don't really choose your work. You're born into it. If your father was a farmer, guess what? You're a farmer. If he hauled stones, you'll be hauling stones. If he cleaned up after donkeys, well, good luck with that. Let's imagine you're part of the majority, a field worker. The sun isn't even high yet, but already you can feel the heat pressing down on you like a heavy blanket. The Nile is both your blessing and your curse. Its yearly floods bring fertile soil that keeps you alive, but it also demands constant attention. Your job? Bend over rows of crops for hours, pulling weeds with your bare hands, while mosquitoes treat your sweaty body like a free buffet. And tools? Forget fancy equipment. You get a wooden plow that splinters in your hands, or a sickle made of sharpened flint glued into wood. Every task feels like it takes twice as long and hurts twice as much. Your back aches, your knees are screaming, and you've barely started. Maybe you're not a farmer. Maybe you're a laborer drafted into one of the pharaoh's massive building projects. That sounds more interesting, right? Wrong. Because building a pyramid isn't the peaceful, mystical job that movies like to show. It's hauling giant blocks of limestone under the merciless sun, sweating through your only linen kilt while your overseer yells at you to move faster. Water? Rationed. Shade? None. Slip and break your leg? Sorry, there's no workers' compensation in ancient Egypt. Just the grim possibility that you'll be replaced tomorrow and forgotten the day after. And then there are the craftsmen, maybe you've lucked into that. Sitting in a small workshop, carving stone statues, or painting tomb walls. Sounds artistic and peaceful, doesn't it? But the reality is choking dust, cramped rooms, and repetitive tasks that leave your hands raw and stiff. Not to mention, your boss is expecting perfection because your work is going in a tomb meant to last for eternity. No pressure. Literally eternal quality control. Meanwhile, your body is begging for water, but remember, that beer you drank this morning doesn't exactly hydrate you. It mostly just leaves you sluggish, sweaty, and mildly buzzed, which, come to think of it, might be the only reason you're able to keep moving at all. And as you work, you look around and notice something. Everyone's exhausted. Everyone's sweating. Everyone looks like they've already lived 5 lifetimes in one morning. Because in ancient Egypt, you don't really live a day, you survive a day. The sun is climbing higher. The ground is radiating heat like an oven. And you realize it's not even noon yet. By now, the sun has climbed high enough to turn the world into a glowing furnace. Shade is no longer a luxury, it's a fantasy. The linen on your back, once cool and airy at dawn, now sticks to your skin like a damp rag. Your sweat has long stopped being refreshing. It just stings your eyes and makes you itch. And here's the cruelest part. There's no such thing as lunch break. Not in the way you imagine it. There's no neatly packed meal waiting in a box. No shady cafe to duck into. Instead, you get a few stolen minutes to chew on some bread, again hard as a brick, and maybe a dried fig if you're lucky. That's your reward before it's back to labor. The midday heat, however, isn't just uncomfortable. It's deadly. Without sunscreen, without sunglasses, without even the concept of a hat brim, you're basically slow cooking under the desert sun. Your skin blisters, your lips crack, and the idea of water becomes something you dream about more than you actually drink. The Nile is right there, but it's not like you can just run over and sip whenever you want. Everything is rationed, controlled, supervised. Now, as you push through this exhaustion, you're reminded of where you stand in the grand hierarchy of ancient Egypt. Spoiler, you're at the bottom. At the very top, there's Pharaoh, living god, ruler of the 2 lands, owner of pretty much everything you see. Then come the nobles, priests, and scribes. They don't sweat under the sun. They don't break their backs lifting stones. They sit in shaded courtyards, sipping wine, recording taxes, and sacrificing goats in ornate temples. And you're a commoner, which is just a polite way of saying expendable. If you drop dead from heat stroke, no one writes your name down. No one sings your story. At best, maybe a cousin will whisper a prayer for you. But history doesn't care. There are, of course, slaves too, prisoners of war or the unlucky debt-ridden. They work beside you, often in worse conditions, often with harsher punishments. Whips aren't just for animals. If you think your boss in the 21st century is tough, imagine one who literally holds a stick to make sure you don't slow down. Even the priests, wrapped in fine linen and smelling of incense, control your fate in ways you can't escape. They claim to speak for the gods, which means they decide when the Nile has been properly honored, when taxes must be paid, when rituals must be followed. Your life, from planting seeds to burying your dead, is tangled in their endless ceremonies. And the irony? While you're out here collapsing from heat, those same priests might be inside a temple, preaching about the eternal balance of Ma'at, the order of the universe. Balance? You're not feeling balanced. You're feeling like a raisin left out in the sun. The hours crawl. Every task feels heavier. Every breath feels hotter. And all the while, the social ladder looms over you. Pharaoh at the top, priests and nobles in the middle, you at the bottom. The more you think about it, the more you realize you're not surviving just the environment. You're surviving the system, and you're losing. The afternoon is a test, not of strength, but of endurance. By now, your arms feel like they've been replaced with sacks of sand. Every muscle in your body is screaming, but the sun still presses down as if it's personally offended by your existence. And here's the part no one tells you. In ancient Egypt, survival wasn't just about work or hunger. It was about staying alive long enough not to be claimed by the 1,000 invisible threats around you. Take the Nile, for example. It looks refreshing, doesn't it? The water sparkles under the sunlight, calling to you like a cool salvation. But step too close and you might not come back. Crocodiles lurk beneath the surface, patient and hungry. Hippopotamuses, yes, the same round animals you see on children's cartoons, are territorial nightmares that could crush a boat with their jaws. People die in that river, not just sometimes, often. So you ration your water. You sip carefully from clay jars. The liquid isn't cold, isn't pure, and often carries more than just relief. Parasites thrive in the Nile. Tiny creatures you can't see slip into your body, burrow deep, and remind you weeks later that every drink is a gamble. Then there's the food. Bread, onions, beans. Sounds simple enough. But without refrigeration, without hygiene, every meal is a roll of the dice. Mold, rot, worms, you can't always tell until it's too late. You chew, you swallow, you hope. And sometimes you wake up at night doubled over, your body fighting an invisible war with bacteria no one knows exists. Medicine, forget the clean, bright clinics you're used to. Here, your doctor is a man in a white kilt holding a jar of honey, some herbs, and a collection of spells. If you're lucky, the honey actually helps. Egyptians did use it to treat wounds. If you're unlucky, they'll smear dung on the cut. Yes, actual dung. It's supposed to draw out the bad spirits. In reality, it draws in infection. And let's talk about accidents. You're swinging heavy tools all day. Stone, wood, bronze, all blunt and dangerous. If your foot slips, if your hand falters, there's no workers' compensation. There's no emergency room. Just blood, dirt, and a slow decline. One broken bone could end your entire ability to work, which means it could end your ability to eat. Even sleep doesn't save you. When you collapse into your straw bed at night, it's not soft rest that greets you. It's fleas, lice, and the faint smell of rot. The insects bite, crawl, and nest in your skin. You're exhausted, but you never really escape. And over it all looms disease. Ancient Egypt is a breeding ground for fevers, plagues, and curses that have no names yet. Malaria, tuberculosis, dysentery, whispered through villages, stealing children and elders first. The priests will say it's the wrath of the gods. You know, it's just another thing waiting to kill you. So you push through the afternoon, thirsty, blistered, aching, not because you're strong, but because there's no choice. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. That's not just your life, it's survival. And you start to realize, maybe you wouldn't survive a single day in ancient Egypt. Maybe you'd be lucky to survive until sundown. At last, the sun begins to sink. The sky shifts from its merciless glare to a softer, dust-streaked orange. You think the work is done, but ancient Egypt doesn't end just because the day does. The evening is a whole different kind of survival. First, the rituals. Everything here, every tiny action carries meaning. You don't just eat, you offer thanks to the gods. You don't just light a lamp. You whisper a prayer so that darkness doesn't invite evil spirits inside. Even washing your face at the end of the day is tied to belief, to cleansing more than dust. Religion isn't a once-a-week appointment here. It's the air you breathe. Step outside, and the horizon itself is sacred. The setting sun? That's Ra, the great solar god, sinking into the underworld to battle chaos through the night. Tomorrow's sunrise isn't just expected. It's a victory. Every day you wake is proof the gods won again. But this constant awareness is not always comforting. It's exhausting. Every illness, every accident, every famine is explained as divine punishment. You're always under watch, always being judged. The wrong word, the wrong offering, the wrong action, it could be the reason your family suffers. And since the priests control that knowledge, survival often means obeying them, whether you believe or not. Now comes the meal. Bread again. Onions again. Maybe a little fish if the Nile was generous. Or some lentils if the granaries weren't raided by mice. You chew slowly in the dim firelight, surrounded by the smoke of oil lamps and the low chatter of your family. And while the meal is plain, there's always a shadow in the back of your mind. The afterlife. Because here's the strange thing. Ancient Egyptians lived hard, brutal lives, but they spent nearly every waking moment preparing for death. Your neighbor might be carving a coffin instead of fixing his roof. A craftsman may spend years painting tomb walls for a man who's still alive. Even you, tired and itchy from fleas, are saving scraps for burial offerings. Why? Because the afterlife isn't a vague idea. It's a destination, as real to you as tomorrow's sunrise. To the Egyptians, death wasn't the end. It was the great journey, a test through deserts of fire, lakes of knives, and a final judgment where your heart would be weighed against a feather. If it was heavier, from lies and sins, it was thrown to a monster with a crocodile head, lion's mane, and hippo's body. That was true death, eternal nothingness. And so, every night before you sleep, you think about your heart. Did you lie today? Did you cheat? Did you curse Ra when your back hurt in the fields? The gods keep score, and one day you'll pay. It's ironic, isn't it? You work endlessly just to stay alive, yet most of your life is spent preparing for when you're not. That's ancient Egypt. Survival in the day, obsession with the night. As the stars creep out, you lie down on your straw mat. The cool breeze finally reaches your skin, and the chatter of your family fades into silence. You close your eyes, exhausted. But sleep here is not rest. It's a rehearsal, a tiny death, a nightly reminder that one day you won't wake up on this side of the Nile. And if you're lucky, maybe tomorrow Ra will rise again, and you'll survive another day. Night in ancient Egypt is not peaceful, at least not the way you might imagine. Yes, the sun is gone. The blazing heat finally gives way to something bearable, even pleasant. The desert cools quickly, and for the first time all day you can breathe without your skin prickling. But with the darkness comes something worse, uncertainty. No lamps line the streets, no electric hum from houses nearby, just shadows stretching out from the firelight of your small oil lamp. and those shadows feel alive. To the Egyptians, night was not simply dark. It was dangerous. It was when the god Apophis, the giant serpent of chaos, tried to swallow Ra's boat and end the world. And who's to say he won't succeed tonight? Practical dangers lurk too. Thieves, wild dogs, even scorpions creeping into your bedding. A single sting in the wrong place and you're gone. Children wake crying, elders whisper prayers, and everyone listens for the rustle of something that shouldn't be there. Then there's the bed, or rather, the lack of it. If you're poor, you lie on the ground, on a mat stuffed with reeds or straw. If you're lucky, you have a wooden headrest to keep bugs from crawling into your ears. Comfortable? No. Effective? Barely. Your neck aches, your skin itches, and sleep comes only when exhaustion wins. Mosquitoes hum by your ear. Fleas bite your ankles. And without screens or sealed walls, every living nuisance can and will find you. So you toss, turn, scratch, and sigh, knowing tomorrow the cycle starts all over again. But worse than pests or thieves are the dreams. To an ancient Egyptian, dreams weren't random flickers of the brain. They were messages. The gods, the dead, even demons used dreams to speak. A good dream could promise fortune. A bad one could curse your entire household. So every night, as you drift off, you brace yourself, not just for rest, but for visions that might doom you. And if you do sleep, it's not for long. You wake often, because the night is not silent. Jackals cry in the distance. Crocodiles splash in the river. The occasional scream, human or animal, pierces the stillness. And through it all, the thought lingers. Maybe RA won't rise tomorrow. Maybe the sun will vanish, swallowed forever. This is how you survive or fail to survive an Egyptian night. Not through comfort, not through peace, but through sheer exhaustion. You close your eyes knowing that sleep itself is risky, but staying awake is impossible. And so you drift, half in this world, half in another, in a fragile balance between survival and surrender. Welcome to ancient Egypt. You made it through the day. Barely. Congratulations, you survived the night. Barely. But before you can even rub the grit from your eyes, the city wakes up around you, and it's louder than you'd expect for the ancient world. Forget the peaceful desert silence you imagined. Living in an Egyptian city, say Memphis or Thebes, means cramped streets, clanging pottery, shouts of merchants, and donkeys braying before sunrise. People live practically on top of each other in mud brick houses stacked so close that privacy is a luxury. Thin walls separate families, so you hear not only your own household's morning chaos but your neighbors too. The coughing, the crying, the scraping of pots. The streets outside are narrow, dusty, and crowded. Vendors are already setting up their stalls, laying out baskets of grain, fish, onions, dates, and bread. If you're wealthy, servants fetch these things for you. If you're poor, you're already haggling before the sun fully clears the horizon. Either way, the smell is less than appetizing. Fresh fish mixes with the stench of drying dung used for fuel, and the constant perfume of human sweat clings to everything. And forget about shoes. Most people walk barefoot or with simple sandals made of reeds, which don't do much against sharp rocks or the mysterious substances you're stepping in. The ground is a patchwork of dust, trash, animal droppings, and spilled beer. Yes, beer. Egyptians drank it like water because water wasn't safe, which means the streets smell faintly like a brewery, and not in the good way. The market is chaos. Farmers shouting their prices, bakers slapping dough, fishmongers waving away flies, stray dogs weaving between people's legs, looking for scraps. And the noise never stops. No alarm clock needed, the city itself is your wake-up call. Now, where do you fit into all this? That depends. If you're poor, and most people are, you live in a cramped, single-room home with your entire family. Maybe a goat or two inside as well, because why not? The air is hot and stale, and smoke from your tiny cooking fire lingers long after breakfast. Your job could be hauling water, carrying bricks, or grinding grain by hand. None of it glamorous, and all of it exhausting. If you're middle class, a scribe, a craftsman, you fare slightly better. You can afford a bit more space, maybe 2 rooms instead of 1. Maybe even a small courtyard. But comfort is relative. The city doesn't smell any better from your window, and the streets don't get less crowded just because you write hieroglyphs instead of hauling rocks. And if you're wealthy, you wake up in a villa with servants fanning you, preparing bread and honey, maybe even figs. Your floors are tiled, your bed is sturdy, and your air is perfumed with incense. But don't get too comfortable. Wealth paints a target on your back. Resentment simmers quietly from those below you. And while your servants smile now, you never really know what they whisper about when you're not listening. Still, regardless of class, one thing unites everyone in the city: the Nile. Its flooding season decides your fate. Whether you're a king, a farmer, or just another tired soul walking the streets. Too little flood, and famine hits. Too much, and homes wash away. Every year, life swings on that delicate balance. So, as the market roars to life, you find yourself lost in the current of people, swept up in a civilization both advanced and strangely fragile. And as you glance around at the noise, the smells, and the endless sea of humanity, one thought creeps in. You're not sure how long you can last here. The sun is climbing now, and it's already hot. Ancient Egypt doesn't exactly offer you an 8-hour workday with breaks and benefits. No, here your body is the tool, and the day grinds on until either the sun sets or you collapse. Let's start with the jobs most people had. Forget the glamour of pyramids and temples. 90% of Egyptians were farmers, and farming was backbreaking work. You spend dawn to dusk bent over fields, coaxing wheat and barley from the stubborn Nile soil. Your tools? Simple wooden plows, hoes, and sickles lined with sharpened flint. Your tractor? A pair of oxen that move at whatever pace they feel like, which is usually slower than you'd like. And there's no off-season. When crops aren't in the ground, you're repairing canals, dredging irrigation ditches, or hauling stones for whatever grand construction project the pharaoh dreams up. If you thought farming was your job, you were mistaken. Your real employer is the state, and your body is on loan until it breaks. If you're not a farmer, maybe you're a laborer. Picture yourself hauling limestone blocks in the blistering heat, roped together with 100 other men, dragging stones heavy enough to crush you flat if someone slips. Your hands blister, your back screams, and there's dust in your lungs that will never leave. You might wonder, how much are you getting paid? Beer, sometimes bread. Not exactly the kind of paycheck that makes the pain feel worth it. If you're a woman, your labor looks different, but no less demanding. You're grinding grain into flour by hand, a task so repetitive and punishing it leaves you with joints like sandpaper by middle age. You're hauling water from the Nile, scrubbing laundry, weaving linen, and keeping children alive in a world where half of them won't reach adulthood. Rest, that's for the wealthy, and even they don't entirely escape the grind. And speaking of wealth, scribes, priests, and officials have a different kind of suffering. Sure, you're not dragging stones or hoeing fields, but your life is ink and papyrus, memorizing endless hieroglyphs, copying records under the unrelenting eye of your superior. Literacy is a privilege, but it comes with pressure. One mistake in a tax record, one poorly written scroll, and your whole career can unravel. The irony? Even priests, those closest to the gods, aren't free from monotony. Their lives are filled with rituals that have to be repeated day after day. Feeding statues of gods, chanting hymns, lighting incense. Imagine dressing a divine statue every single morning, polishing its face, offering it meals it doesn't eat. You do it not because you want to, but because you have to. Miss a ritual and people believe disaster will follow. No pressure. Now let's not forget the craftsmen. Stonecutters, carpenters, potters, metalworkers. Their skills build Egypt's grandeur. But their reality, dust-filled lungs, blistered fingers, hunched backs, and years shaved off their lives from inhaling fine particles day after day. If you think their work bought them luxury, think again. Most lived simply, in small, hot houses, their masterpieces enriching everyone but themselves. By midday, the heat is suffocating. Shade is rare, water isn't always clean, and food is simple bread, onions, maybe fish if you're lucky. And remember, beer isn't a treat here. It's survival. Weak, cloudy, and thick. It hydrates you just enough to keep you moving, which means you're constantly working in a mild haze, somewhere between hungry, thirsty, and exhausted. And there's no weekend coming. Egyptians didn't have Saturdays and Sundays off. Work was life, broken only by festivals, moments of celebration that were as much religious obligation as they were actual rest. You prayed, you sang, you danced, and then you went back to the fields, the quarries, or the endless grindstone. So, by the time the sun starts leaning west, your muscles ache, your throat is dry, and your only thought is, how much longer can I do this? The truth is, if you were suddenly dropped into ancient Egypt, the work alone might finish you before disease or famine even gets the chance. After hours of crushing work, you finally get to think about food. Don't get too excited. Ancient Egyptian cuisine isn't exactly five-star dining. It's more functional. You eat to survive, not to savor. Your main staple? Bread. Mountains of bread. Loaves made from emmer wheat, coarse and dense, often baked with sand and grit from the grinding stones. Imagine chewing bread that slowly files your teeth down with every bite. By your 30s, your molars are cracked and worn to nubs. Dentistry? Not really a thing. Pain relief? None. So yes, you're basically eating your own dental destruction. To wash it down, you drink beer. But this isn't the crisp, golden drink you picture today. Egyptian beer was thick, porridge-like, cloudy, and sometimes flavored with dates or honey, if you were lucky. It wasn't just a beverage. It was a meal in itself, filling and cheap. Everyone drank it, even children. Water from the Nile wasn't always safe, so beer was the safer option. just don't expect it to taste good. Onions were another staple. Egyptians loved them so much they were practically a currency. They believed onions had magical properties, even placing them in the eyes of the dead for protection in the afterlife. For you, though, onions are less mystical and more monotonous. You eat them raw with bread day after day. Your breath? Legendary in the worst way. Fish from the Nile is common, though you might worry about parasites. And for the wealthy, they get more variety. Beef, goose, duck, fruit, and honey. But for you, meat is rare. A festival treat, maybe. Most of your protein comes from lentils, beans, and the occasional lucky catch from the river. And let's talk about flavor. Forget salt and pepper shakers. Seasoning was minimal: garlic, leeks, coriander, maybe a pinch of cumin if you had access. But most meals were bland. Bread, onions, beer. Bread, onions, beer. Day after day. Kept you alive, yes, but barely. Malnutrition was common, and so were stomach issues. Parasites, dysentery, food poisoning, it's all part of the dining experience. And if you think you can escape monotony with dessert, don't. Honey was rare and expensive. Most Egyptians might taste it only a handful of times in their lives. Fruit like dates and figs were more common, but they were seasonal and you couldn't just pop into a shop for a quick snack. The irony is that Egyptians loved food so much, they filled tombs with it. Bread, beer, onions, all to make sure the dead had something to eat in the afterlife. Which means that even in eternity, you're still chewing sandy bread and drinking lukewarm beer. So yes, your diet keeps you going, but it doesn't make life much sweeter. You chew, swallow, and sigh, wondering if tomorrow's meal will taste any different. Spoiler, it won't. Life in ancient Egypt wasn't all sand in your bread and back-breaking labor. Even the most exhausted farmer or builder needed a break from monotony. So what did entertainment look like when there was no Netflix, no TikTok, not even a radio? For starters, board games. Yes, Egyptians were obsessed with them. The most famous was Senet, a game played on a grid of 30 squares with little pieces you moved according to throws of knucklebones. It wasn't just a pastime. It had spiritual meaning too. Winning might symbolize your safe journey through the afterlife. So, imagine yourself sitting in the dim light, flicking knucklebones, muttering curses at your bad luck, knowing that your eternal fate, at least symbolically, rested on the roll. Then there was Mehen, another board game shaped like a coiled snake, with pieces racing along its body. Was it fun? Hard to say. Was it distracting enough to forget that you've been chewing gritty bread all day? Probably. Music and dancing were also common. Harps, flutes, lutes, and percussion instruments filled festivals and rituals. The rhythms were lively, but for you, this wasn't casual listening, it was communal. Music was tied to worship, to ceremonies, to celebrations. You wouldn't slip in earbuds while grinding wheat, but you might join your neighbors in a noisy festival honoring Hathor, goddess of joy and love, and let the drums drown out your daily misery. Festivals themselves were the real highlights. The Nile's flooding season meant work paused, and instead, entire communities joined in religious feasts. You'd drink, you'd eat, better than usual, and maybe for a few days life actually felt good. The gods got offerings, and you got a rare taste of meat or honey cakes. But don't let the fun fool you. It was also political. Festivals reinforced loyalty to the pharaoh and reminded you who kept the gods happy. Speaking of gods, religion wasn't a Sunday hobby here. It was the air you breathed. Every part of your life was tangled with it. You woke up under Ra's sun, prayed for fertile fields to Osiris, and feared the judgment of Anubis when you died. Even household chores had a divine shadow. Grinding grain, thank Renanudit, goddess of nourishment. Delivering a baby, that's Tarit's domain. Catching a cold, clearly a god was displeased. And then there was magic, spells, amulets, charms. Ordinary Egyptians clung to them. Carved scarab beetle for luck. A protective chant to keep snakes away. In a world with little medical science, magic was both comfort and placebo. Did it work? Who knows? But when your other option was to hope your toothache didn't kill you, muttering a spell seemed worth a try. So yes, despite the grind, Egyptians carved out little islands of joy. They gambled over Senate boards. They danced to flutes. They crowded festivals. They prayed and hoped the gods listened. For a few hours at a time, you could escape the monotony and believe that life was more than sweat and onions. But don't get too comfortable, because dawn always comes, and with it the work begins again. If you've made it this far in ancient Egypt, congratulations. But don't pat yourself on the back too hard, because now we get to the truly fragile part of existence. Staying alive. Let's start with food. We've already established your bread is full of sand and grit, which means your teeth are already betraying you. By your late 20s, they're ground down to stubs, riddled with abscesses, and every meal feels like chewing gravel. No toothpaste, no dentists, just pain. But maybe you'll get lucky and avoid tooth infections. That still leaves parasites. Worms, fleas, lice, take your pick. The Nile's water was life-giving, but it was also a breeding ground for disease. Bilharzia, a nasty parasitic infection, was so common it might as well have been a national pastime. Symptoms included abdominal pain, bloody urine, and eventually organ damage. Fun. And if parasites didn't get you, malnutrition might. Bread and beer formed your staples, but without much variety, your body lacked vitamins. Stunted growth, weak bones, fatigue, you were never really at full strength. Children often died young, and those who survived rarely made it to what we'd call old age. Living into your 40s was practically heroic. But wait, it gets better. Medicine existed, sort of. Egyptian healers were half doctors, half priests, half magicians. Yes, that's three halves, but logic wasn't their priority. They'd prescribe honey for wounds, which, to be fair, actually works because honey has antibacterial properties. They'd also whip up remedies like ground ostrich eggs, moldy bread, or crocodile dung for various ailments. Spoiler, most of those didn't help. Surgery? Not in the way you're imagining. No anesthesia, no sterile tools, no painkillers stronger than beer and prayers. Minor procedures were possible, but anything serious, say a broken bone that pierced the skin, was a death sentence. Childbirth? A lottery. Women gave birth squatting on special bricks, attended by other women, guided by chants and amulets. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Maternal mortality rates were brutal, and infant deaths were heartbreakingly common. You might lose multiple children before one survived to adulthood. Plagues also swept through now and then. Without the concept of germs, Egyptians blamed angry gods or malevolent spirits. Priests would chant, incense would burn, offerings would be made. but the disease ran its course anyway. So in summary, your body was under constant siege. From food that wore down your teeth, water that infected your organs, pests that drained your blood, childbirth that threatened your life, and medical practices that helped just enough to give you false hope. And yet, Egyptians kept going. They laughed, they played Senate, they prayed, they worked the fields, and they dreamed of an afterlife where pain and disease would finally end. For them, survival wasn't about living comfortably. It was about enduring long enough to hand the torch to the next generation, trusting that the gods, or at least the Nile, would keep the cycle spinning. So, after one exhausting day in ancient Egypt, ask yourself, do you really think you'd survive a lifetime? Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing your boss isn't just your boss. He's also your president, your pope, your military commander, and, oh yeah, an actual god. That was the pharaoh. To an ancient Egyptian, the pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was the living embodiment of Horus on earth, the divine link between the mortal world and the gods. His job wasn't just ruling the country, it was keeping the entire universe in balance. If the Nile didn't flood enough, if famine struck, if enemies invaded, somehow it was the pharaoh's fault. No pressure. But don't picture him striding around in golden sandals solving everyone's problems personally. Most of the time, pharaohs were busy performing rituals, receiving tribute, and being carried around in processions. They were symbols more than administrators. And yet, their presence shaped everything. Their face was carved into temples, statues, and monuments across the land. Their names were written in cartouches, protected by magical ovals. You couldn't go anywhere without being reminded. This land belongs to Pharaoh. Your harvest? Pharaoh's. Your labor? Pharaoh's. Your very existence? Also Pharaoh's. Of course, behind this image of divine authority was the messy reality of politics. Pharaohs had to keep powerful nobles happy, maintain control of priests who claimed their own slice of divine authority, and, if they were lucky, avoid being assassinated or overthrown. Some pharaohs were legendary, like Ramses II, who loved building monuments to himself so much that archaeologists today sometimes wonder if there's an ancient no-vacancy sign in Egypt's sandstone. Others, like Akhenaten, tried to shake things up. He basically invented a new religion worshipping one god, Aten, and sidelined the old priesthood. Spoiler, that experiment didn't last. After his death, the old gods marched right back in. Then there were child pharaohs like Tutankhamun, whose fame today comes less from his accomplishments and more from the fact that his tomb wasn't looted. Imagine being a teenager with absolute divine authority, and then dying before you could do much with it. That was Tut's story. Still, whether a pharaoh was strong, weak, beloved, or despised, to the average Egyptian, he was untouchable. You didn't complain about Pharaoh. You didn't joke about Pharaoh. You bowed, you obeyed, and you prayed he kept the gods happy so your crops wouldn't fail. So, in the grand theater of ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was both the star of the show and the stage itself. He, or in rare cases, she, like Hatshepsut, was the reason the kingdom functioned at all. Without Pharaoh, life would collapse into chaos. At least, that's what everyone believed. But of course, one god-king can't run an entire civilization alone. That's where we move next. The massive machinery of government, viziers, scribes, tax collectors, and the endless paperwork of ancient Egypt. Because if you thought bureaucracy was invented in the modern age, oh no, ancient Egypt got there first. Now, if the pharaoh was the divine face of Egypt, the real workhorses of the kingdom were the people behind the scenes, the bureaucrats. Every empire needs middle management, and Egypt had perfected it thousands of years before anyone coined the term. At the top of this pyramid, pun fully intended, sat the vizier. Think of him as the pharaoh's right-hand man, the chief of staff, prime minister, and head accountant rolled into one. He supervised everything: taxes, courts, agriculture, the military, you name it. The pharaoh got the glory, the vizier got the headaches. Below the vizier were armies of scribes. These were the paper pushers, the note-takers, the record-keepers. And while they weren't warriors or priests, they had something almost as powerful: literacy. Being able to read and write hieroglyphs or hieratic script gave them immense value. Scribes kept track of harvests, measured out grain in storehouses, and wrote down contracts. They also made sure everyone paid their taxes, because in Egypt, taxes weren't just money, they were the very fuel of the state. And taxes came in many forms. Sometimes you paid in grain, sometimes in livestock, sometimes in labor, like being summoned to haul stones for a temple or dig irrigation canals. No matter who you were, you owed something to the state. And rest assured, the scribes made absolutely certain it was recorded in painful detail. Picture it. You've just finished a back-breaking harvest, and a man in a linen kilt with a reed pen and a papyrus scroll shows up at your door. He carefully measures your grain, writes it down, and reminds you that Pharaoh will be expecting his share. You can't exactly argue. The pen in Egypt was almost as mighty as the sword. And if you didn't pay, well, ancient Egyptians had ways of making you cooperate. Fines, confiscation of goods, even beatings. It wasn't exactly a system that relied on gentle persuasion. Now here's the ironic part. This obsessive bureaucracy is one of the reasons Egypt lasted as long as it did. The Nile might flood and recede, dynasties might rise and fall, but the scribes just kept writing. They're the reason we know so much today, because they documented everything from royal decrees to farmer complaints. But don't imagine bureaucracy was quick or efficient. Papyrus piles could get lost, corrupt officials could fudge the numbers, and bribes could smooth things over. In other words, it wasn't so different from bureaucracy today. The only difference is that instead of sending angry emails to the tax office, you'd probably just mutter a prayer to the gods and hope your grain didn't vanish mysteriously into someone else's storage jar. So yes, Egypt was a land of gods and monuments, but it was also a land of ledgers, receipts, and audits. The kind of stuff no Hollywood movie wants to show, but which kept the whole civilization humming along. And as we leave behind the halls of administration and the scratch of the scribe's pen, let's step into another realm of power. The temples, priests, and the endless business of keeping the gods happy. Because in Egypt, religion wasn't just faith, it was politics, economy, and daily survival rolled into one. If you thought the pharaoh was powerful, wait until you meet the priests. Because in ancient Egypt, religion wasn't just a matter of private faith. It was the very backbone of society. And the priesthood ran it like a very polished, very sacred corporation. Temples weren't small chapels for quiet prayer. No, they were sprawling complexes, massive stone courtyards, towering pylons, decorated halls echoing with chants. Think of them as a combination of church, bank, university, and government office all rolled into one. Why a bank? Because temples controlled enormous wealth. Land, livestock, granaries, whole estates were dedicated to feeding the gods, which really meant feeding the priests who took care of the god statues. Offerings flowed in constantly: grain, cattle, gold, oils, perfumes. These didn't just sit around gathering dust. They were redistributed, traded, invested. A temple wasn't just holy ground. It was an economic engine. And the priests themselves? Well, they weren't always the solemn, holy men we might picture. Sure, they performed rituals, recited hymns, and kept the gods satisfied. But they also managed resources, kept ledgers, and wielded political clout. A high priest of Ammonius in Thebes, for instance, could rival the pharaoh in influence. Imagine a CEO of a Fortune 500 company who also happens to claim he can talk directly to the gods. That's the kind of power we're talking about. Every morning, priests would wake the gods. Literally. They'd enter the inner sanctum, wash the statue, anoint it with oil, dress it in fresh linen, and present it with food. Then, in the evening, they'd put the god to bed again. Now, whether the god actually needed all this TLC is debatable, but one thing is certain: it gave the priests steady employment and reinforced their authority. Of course, access to the gods was carefully controlled. Ordinary Egyptians weren't allowed into the inner sanctum. They could worship outside, leave offerings, or join festivals, but the real divine encounters were strictly for the priesthood. This made temples feel both accessible and untouchable, comforting and intimidating all at once. And then there were the festivals. Festivals. Imagine entire cities coming alive with music, feasting, dancing, and processions of gilded boats carrying the gods' statues down the Nile. These events weren't just religious. They were community bonding, entertainment, and political theater rolled into one. For a farmer who spent most of the year hunched over his fields, a festival was a rare chance to cut loose and maybe catch a glimpse of the divine. But beneath all the incense and chanting was a sharp reality. Religion was business. Priests collected offerings, managed properties, and kept people in line with promises of divine favor or threats of divine punishment. It's hard to argue about your tax burden when the guy demanding grain for the temple also claims he speaks for the sun god Ra. So while the pharaoh might be the god king on earth, the priests were the day-to-day managers of the spiritual economy. And their influence ran deep, so deep, in fact, that at certain points in history, the priesthood was more powerful than the crown. A delicate balance, one that sometimes tipped into open rivalry. But religion wasn't just about politics and money. It also shaped how Egyptians thought about life itself, why the Nile flooded, why the sun rose, and what awaited them after death. Which brings us, slowly, to one of the most fascinating and sometimes unnerving aspects of Egyptian civilization: their obsession with the afterlife. If there's one thing the Egyptians really didn't take lightly, it was death. To them, death wasn't an end, it was a continuation. Life was just a short chapter in a much longer book, and the afterlife was where the real story began. But here's the catch. Getting into the afterlife wasn't automatic. You had to pass a series of tests, rituals, and cosmic checkpoints. Imagine the world's most bureaucratic airport security, except instead of confiscating your water bottle, they're weighing your heart against a feather. Yes, that was the central idea, the weighing of the heart. When you died, your heart was placed on a scale opposite the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and order. If your heart was heavy with lies and sins, it tipped the scale, and you were tossed to Amit the Devourer, a terrifying chimera with the head of a crocodile, the mane of a lion, and the body of a hippopotamus. Essentially, she was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a paper shredder for souls. One bite and you were gone forever. But if your heart was light, pure, and balanced, congratulations. You earned your spot in the field of reeds, a sort of paradise that mirrored earthly life but better. Crops grew taller, the Nile always flowed, and you could spend eternity with your loved ones. In short, eternal bliss, if you made the cut. Of course, to even reach that judgment hall, your body had to be preserved. And this is where the Egyptians perfected the art of mummification. It wasn't just about wrapping bodies in linen like some Halloween costume. No, it was a meticulous 70-day process. First, embalmers removed the internal organs, most of them anyway. The lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver were carefully dried, treated, and stored in canopic jars, each guarded by a protective deity. The brain? Well, that was usually yanked out through the nose with a hook and tossed away, because Egyptians didn't think it was particularly important. The heart, though, that was often left inside because you'd need it for that final weighing. Then came the drying process. The body was packed with natron, a naturally occurring salt that dehydrated the flesh. After weeks of this, the embalmers cleaned the body, anointed it with oils, and wrapped it in hundreds of yards of fine linen. Amulets and charms were slipped between the layers to protect the soul on its journey. Finally, the mummy was placed in a coffin, sometimes several coffins nested like Russian dolls, and sealed in a tomb. But not just any tomb. Oh no. Tombs were custom-designed eternal houses. Wealthy Egyptians had elaborate chambers filled with food, furniture, jewelry, and even board games to use in the afterlife. Pharaohs, of course, went all out. Pyramids, richly decorated tombs in the Valley of the Kings, walls covered with spells and guides from the Book of the Dead, a literal instruction manual for navigating the afterlife. This obsession with eternity made Egyptian culture feel strangely paradoxical. On the one hand, life was fragile, famines, disease, accidents. But on the other hand, they prepared for death with such certainty, such precision, that it almost feels like they were more invested in the afterlife than in life itself. And in a way they were, because in their worldview, the afterlife wasn't some abstract hope. It was as real as the Nile, as tangible as the pyramids rising out of the desert. Death wasn't an end, it was a departure lounge, and the Egyptians made sure you had the best ticket money and offerings could buy. So, when you think of ancient Egypt, don't just think of mummies gathering dust in a museum case. Think of a culture that devoted centuries of knowledge, art, and architecture to making sure no one faced eternity unprepared. And speaking of eternity, let's step back to the living world again. Because while the Egyptians dreamed of paradise, their day-to-day survival still depended on something far more earthly: food, work, and the struggle of everyday life along the Nile. Now, while pharaohs were busy planning their afterlife real estate and priests were reciting spells over jars of natron, the vast majority of Egyptians were simply trying to get by. And here's the thing. Most of them weren't kings, priests, or even soldiers. They were farmers. The backbone of Egypt's entire civilization rested on the shoulders of people who spent their days ankle-deep in mud, coaxing food from the land. Life revolved around the Nile. When the river flooded, farmers rushed to plant barley, wheat, and flax in the nutrient-rich soil it left behind. When it receded, they harvested, storing grain in mud-brick granaries. Bread and beer, yes, beer, were the staples of their diet. Not the frothy craft kind you find today, but a thick, porridge-like brew, full of calories and safer to drink than water. Egyptians drank it morning, noon, and night, even kids. And speaking of diet, meat was rare for most families. Maybe a bit of fish, maybe some birds. Vegetables like onions, garlic, and lentils were common. If you were lucky, figs or dates sweetened the table. A feast for the rich was everyday survival food for the poor. Work wasn't just farming, though. Skilled laborers worked on construction sites, yes, those legendary pyramids and temples. Contrary to the popular myth, the pyramids weren't built by endless lines of slaves whipped into exhaustion. Archaeology shows the workers were actually paid laborers, fed, housed, and rotated seasonally, often during the agricultural off-season. Think of it as national service, mixed with a massive public works project. Still, it was grueling. Sun beating down, limestone blocks weighing tons, and you're hauling them up ramps with nothing but muscle, ropes, and determination. No wonder backs gave out, bones fractured, and skeletons from workers' villages show plenty of wear and tear. Then there were artisans, carpenters, stone carvers, potters, and painters. Their work filled tombs with vibrant images. Scenes of banquets, fishing trips, religious rituals, and even board games. These were not idle doodles. They were snapshots of daily life, preserved for eternity. And let's not forget the families. Most houses were small mud brick rectangles, simple, crowded, and often shared with livestock. Privacy, not really a thing. Families were large, children were everywhere, and life expectancy was short. If you made it to 40, you were considered elderly. Children, by the way, had surprisingly free lives. They played with dolls, wooden toys, and balls made of leather. They also went without clothes until their teenage years. Not exactly the strict upbringing you might imagine. School was mostly for the elite, where scribes in training learned to write on papyrus with reed pens dipped in ink. Everyone else? They learned farming, weaving, or whatever trade kept the household afloat. Social structure was rigid, but not completely immovable. Scribes, for example, held significant prestige. Being literate in a society where most people weren't made you powerful. Priests, too, wielded authority, managing temples that doubled as banks and political hubs. Women, interestingly, had more rights in Egypt than in many ancient cultures. They could own property, initiate divorce, and conduct business. Not exactly modern equality, but certainly progressive for 3,000 years ago. Still, life was harsh. Disease was constant, malaria, parasites, infections. Medicine existed, with treatments blending herbal remedies and incantations, but most cures were hit or miss. Broken bones, dental abscesses, malnutrition, these were everyday realities. And yet, Egyptians endured generation after generation, sustained by their river, their gods, and their belief in a world beyond death. When you picture ancient Egypt, it's easy to imagine gold masks, towering pyramids, and glittering treasures. But the truth is, the empire was built not just by kings, but by countless ordinary men and women whose lives were quiet, repetitive, and often exhausting. And maybe that's the most human part of their story. For every grand monument or immortal pharaoh, There were thousands of hands baking bread, planting grain, carving stone, and rocking children to sleep, under the same stars that still shine over the Nile tonight. If you lived in ancient Egypt, religion wasn't something you did on weekends. It wasn't a private belief system you practiced quietly at home. It was everything. It was in the river, in the sunrise, in the grain you harvested, and in the breath you exhaled. The gods were everywhere, and they were watching. The Egyptian pantheon was extensive. Hundreds of deities, each with a specialty, each with a personality. Some were terrifying, others comforting, most were somewhere in between. You might start your morning whispering a prayer to Ra, the sun god, as the fiery disk rose over the horizon. Without him, the world would drown in darkness. Then you'd thank Hapi, the god of the Nile flood, for making the soil fertile. If your cow gave birth, you might offer a little bread to Hathor, goddess of love, music, and motherhood. And when illness struck, you'd look to Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague and healing. The gods were depicted in countless forms, part human, part animal, sometimes entirely animal. The jackal-headed Anubis guarded the dead. The ibis-headed Thoth kept records of human deeds. The falcon-headed Horus represented kingship and protection. And of course, Osiris, god of the underworld, judged your soul after death. Religion wasn't abstract philosophy, it was action. It was ritual. Every day, priests performed ceremonies in temples that were as much centers of power as they were places of worship. Temples weren't open to the public. Common people gathered outside, while priests tended the inner sanctuaries, bathing statues of the gods, dressing them in fresh linens, and offering food. These weren't just stone figures. They were believed to house the actual essence of the deity. The grandest of these temples were astonishing. Massive pylons carved with hieroglyphs, columns rising like forests, walls painted with scenes of gods and kings side by side. But even the humblest shrine in a village might hold a clay idol, smeared with offerings of bread, beer, or incense. Rituals structured daily life. Festivals filled the calendar, honoring gods with parades, feasts, and music. Ordinary people rarely got to enter the sacred halls, but on feast days, statues of the gods were carried out into the streets, so the divine could literally walk among mortals. Imagine the awe of watching your city's protector god sail down the Nile in a golden shrine, surrounded by priests chanting hymns while crowds cheered from the riverbanks. Magic was also woven into Egyptian religion. Spells were inscribed on papyri, amulets were worn to ward off evil, and charms were placed in homes to protect against misfortune. The boundary between practical medicine and religious magic was thin. A poultice of herbs might be prescribed for an infection, but accompanied by an incantation to chase away the spirit believed to cause it. What's remarkable is how inclusive Egyptian religion was. The pantheon kept expanding. New gods were absorbed from conquered regions, blended with old ones, or combined in strange hybrids. The Greeks, when they later encountered Egyptian deities, were both confused and fascinated. But for Egyptians, it was simply life. Religion wasn't only about worship, it was also about order. The concept of Ma'at, truth, balance, justice, and cosmic harmony, was the foundation of their worldview. The pharaoh was the ultimate guardian of Ma'at, ensuring that society remained balanced, that temples were maintained, that rituals were performed, and that the Nile's cycles were honored. To break Maat was to invite chaos, famine, invasion, disaster. And when you died, Maat was there too. Your heart would be weighed against the feather of Maat in the hall of judgment. Too heavy with sin? Your soul would be devoured by Amit, the crocodile lion hippo monster who stood ready to erase you from existence. Live a balanced life? You earned eternity in the blissful fields of reeds, a paradise that looked suspiciously like a perfect version of Egypt. So, as you lay in bed at night in ancient Egypt, listening to the croak of frogs on the Nile or the rustle of reeds in the breeze, you wouldn't just think about tomorrow's harvest. You'd think about the gods, the unseen powers that governed every grain of sand. And you'd whisper a prayer, hoping they listened. In ancient Egypt, death was not an ending. It was a transition, a continuation of life, but on a different plane. To Egyptians, the afterlife was just as real as the Nile flowing outside their window, and preparing for it was a lifelong project. You see, the Egyptians were optimists, sort of. They didn't think death was the end, but they were also realists. They knew survival in the next world required preparation. Just like you needed bread and beer to get through the workday, you needed spells, amulets, and a properly preserved body to navigate eternity. The first and most famous step was mummification. Yes, the iconic wrapping in linen, but it wasn't just about bandages. It was an elaborate, painstaking ritual that could take 70 days. Priests carefully removed organs, placing them in canopic jars guarded by protective deities. The brain, often pulled out through the nose with a hook, because apparently it wasn't considered important enough to keep. The heart, however, was sacred. It was believed to contain the essence of your being, your morality, your thoughts. Without it, you couldn't pass judgment in the afterlife. The body was dried with natron salt, then wrapped in layer upon layer of linen, each bound with prayers and charms to protect you. Amulets were tucked in between layers. Scarabs for rebirth, the Eye of Horus for protection, Ankhs for eternal life. When finished, the mummy wasn't just a preserved corpse. It was a vessel ready to house the soul on its eternal journey. But mummification wasn't cheap. It was a privilege for the wealthy, the elite, and of course the pharaohs. Ordinary Egyptians couldn't afford such luxury. Their burials were simpler, perhaps a body in the desert sand, where natural conditions preserved it well enough. Still, even the poor found ways to honor their dead, offering little clay figurines or modest amulets, hoping for safe passage. And safe passage mattered, because the journey to the afterlife wasn't a casual stroll. According to Egyptian belief, your soul faced trials. At the climax came the weighing of the heart. You stood before Osiris, god of the dead, while Anubis placed your heart on a scale. On the other side, the feather of Maat, representing truth and justice. If your heart was lighter than the feather, congratulations. You were pure, and your soul could enter the field of reeds, a paradise of endless harvests, gentle breezes, and eternal comfort. If your heart was heavy with sin, though things got awkward, Amit, the devourer, waited nearby, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. If your heart failed the test, she ate it, not in a cute, symbolic way, in a literal, soul-annihilating way. You didn't get eternal torture. You didn't even get to exist. You were erased. For an Egyptian, that was the ultimate horror, total oblivion. To avoid such a fate, the living did their part. They left food offerings at tombs, recited prayers, and hired priests to chant spells for the deceased. Tombs weren't just graves, they were houses for eternity. Walls were painted with scenes of daily life, farming, fishing, feasting. Not because the dead needed a scrapbook, but because these images magically became real in the afterlife. A painted loaf of bread? It became a loaf of bread for your eternal table. A carved servant figure, called a shabdi? It sprang to life and did your chores for you in the next world. Even in death, Egyptians were practical, they outsourced labor. The wealthy built monumental tombs, culminating in the most famous structures of all, the pyramids. These weren't just oversized graves. They were cosmic machines, designed to launch the pharaoh's soul into the heavens. The very shape of the pyramid represented the rays of the sun, guiding the king upward to join Ra in the sky. Imagine spending your entire life constructing a mountain of stone, just so one man could travel safely to eternity. But tombs were also treasure vaults, stuffed with gold, jewelry, weapons, chariots, even board games. Why? Because you might need those things in the next life. Unfortunately, tomb robbers tended to need those things in this life, and within a few generations, many were looted. The Egyptians, ever inventive, responded with hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Winding corridors cut into cliffs, sealed with curses warning intruders of divine punishment. Even so, death rituals were less about wealth and more about continuity. Whether you were a pharaoh in a gilded sarcophagus or a farmer wrapped in a rough shroud, the goal was the same: survive the perilous journey and enter eternity. And at night, when the living lit incense at family shrines, speaking the names of ancestors, they believed the dead still lingered, listening, watching, maybe even protecting. To be remembered was to live. To be forgotten was to die a second time. So, in ancient Egypt, death wasn't frightening in the way we think of it. It was inevitable, yes, complicated, certainly, but also hopeful. It was a chance at forever, as long as you followed the rituals, spoke the right spells, and lived a life balanced with Ma'at. If you stripped away the temples, the tombs, and the golden masks, life in ancient Egypt was surprisingly ordinary. Most people weren't pharaohs or priests. They were farmers, laborers, craftsmen, mothers, children, living by the rhythm of the Nile. Picture yourself waking up at dawn in a mud brick house. It isn't large, just a few small rooms, maybe a flat roof where you sometimes sleep during hot summer nights. The walls are plastered white to reflect the sun, and the floors are made of simple packed earth. Furniture? Minimal. A wooden stool, a reed mat, perhaps a low table. That's it. Forget your modern luxuries. No mattress, no sofa, and definitely no coffee machine to rescue you. Your morning begins with bread. Always bread. Egyptians practically lived on it. The dough was coarse, often filled with sand and grit that got mixed in during grinding. Over time, this wore down people's teeth until they were little more than stubs. You'd wash it down with beer, not the fizzy kind you're thinking of, but a thick porridge-like brew. Everyone drank it, even children. It was nutritious, safer than river water, and, well, it took the edge off another long day. If you were a farmer, your work depended on the Nile. During the inundation, when the river flooded its banks, you might patch up dikes and channels, or pay taxes with labor on state projects. Once the waters receded, you planted wheat, barley, flax. Later, you harvested with sickles, storing grain in mud-brick silos. Farming wasn't glamorous, but it was the backbone of Egypt's wealth. Pharaohs built temples with taxes skimmed from your sweat. If you weren't farming, you might be in a workshop, baking pottery, weaving linen, carving wood, or hammering copper tools. Skilled craftsmen sometimes worked directly for temples, creating statues and ornaments to honor the gods. Others produced goods for trade: sandals, jewelry, cosmetics. Even ordinary people wore eye paint, coal, not just for fashion, but to reduce glare from the sun and keep away flies. Yes, makeup as sunscreen and bug spray. Genius. Children, meanwhile, had chores early on. Girls helped their mothers grind grain, fetch water, or care for younger siblings. Boys might herd goats or run errands. But there was also time for games, playing with clay dolls, marbles, or a board game called Senet, which doubled as a spiritual practice, representing the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Even play was woven into religion. Family life was the center of existence. Marriages were practical arrangements, based less on romance and more on partnership. Husbands farmed or crafted. Wives managed the household, baked bread, brewed beer, spun thread. Women, interestingly, had more legal rights in Egypt than in many other ancient cultures. They could own property, inherit wealth, even divorce. They weren't equal to men, but compared to Greece or Rome centuries later, Egyptian women had surprising freedom. The daily rhythm was punctuated by festivals. Temples often hosted processions where gods were carried through the streets in gilded boats, while ordinary people clapped, danced, and drank beer in celebration. These were moments when the divine and the mundane overlapped, when farmers and pharaohs alike stood under the same blazing sun and looked up at the same sacred images. But let's not romanticize it. Ordinary life was also harsh. The sun beat down relentlessly, illnesses spread easily, and dental pain from gritty bread was almost universal. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years. Work was backbreaking, food was basic, and leisure was rare. Yet, people adapted. They sang songs in the fields, told stories at night, and trusted in the gods to bring order out of chaos. To survive in ancient Egypt wasn't about grand monuments or eternal afterlives. It was about getting through each day, baking the bread, hauling the water, tending the crops, raising the children. And in a way, it's comforting. Thousands of years later, stripped of all the grandeur, their lives weren't so different from ours. They worked, they worried, they celebrated, they loved. Their world was ancient, but their humanity was timeless. After long days under the scorching Egyptian sun, even the hardest-working farmer or craftsman needed some kind of relief. And while Netflix, smartphones, or scrolling endlessly on Reddit weren't an option, the Egyptians did know how to unwind in their own ways. First, music. Imagine the warm evening air filling with the sound of flutes, lyres, and drums. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was woven into rituals, festivals, and even everyday life. Laborers sometimes sang to keep rhythm as they hauled heavy stones, much like sea shanties centuries later. In homes, families played rattles or clapped to simple songs. Some of the lyrics we found are surprisingly cheerful, playful tunes about drinking beer or enjoying love. Not exactly what you'd expect from a society obsessed with death and the afterlife. Dancing was another favorite. Professional dancers performed at banquets, twisting and moving in ways that must have looked dazzling by flickering torchlight. But dancing wasn't just for the elite. Ordinary people danced at festivals too. Picture a noisy crowd in a village square, children stomping in circles, women swaying in lines, laughter echoing through the night. Then, of course, there were games. The most famous was Senet, a board game played with grids and pieces, sort of like a mix between checkers and snakes and ladders. But here's the twist. It was also symbolic of the soul's journey through the afterlife. So yes, in ancient Egypt, even your game night doubled as spiritual training for eternity. Other games included mehen, played on a spiral-shaped board, and simple toys like balls made from papyrus or rag dolls for kids. Speaking of kids, they had their own kind of fun. Little ones played tag, mock wrestling, or tossed sticks and stones in simple challenges. Archaeologists have found tiny wooden animals with wheels, essentially the world's first pull toys. It's oddly comforting to realize that children thousands of years ago weren't so different from kids today. Running, laughing, finding joy in the simplest things. Leisure also meant food and drink. While daily meals were simple, bread, onions, beer, banquets were lavish affairs. Imagine sitting on a low stool while servants brought trays of roasted goose, fresh fish, figs, dates, and honey cakes. Musicians played, dancers performed, guests drank beer and wine until the night blurred. The wealthy wore fragrant cones of perfumed wax on their heads, which slowly melted in the heat, releasing pleasant scents. Not exactly your average dinner party trick. And then there were festivals, the true highlight of the year. Entire towns would light up during religious processions. Gods were paraded through streets on sacred boats. Temples opened their gates, and everyone celebrated. Beer flowed freely. The festival of Hathor, goddess of love and joy, was especially famous for wild singing and dancing. Picture Mardi Gras, but in linen kilts and under the blazing desert sun. Even quieter moments counted as leisure. Sitting on a rooftop at dusk, watching the Nile turn golden. Listening to a storyteller weave tales of Ra's journey through the underworld, or the mischievous tricks of Seth. Or simply lying back and watching the stars. A habit Egyptians mastered, since their entire calendar and navigation depended on the night sky. So yes, ancient Egypt was harsh and demanding, but its people laughed, played, danced, and sang just like us. They weren't just laborers building monuments for eternity. They were human beings, finding ways to make the long days a little brighter. If you happen to get sick in ancient Egypt, you might be surprised to find yourself treated by one of the most advanced medical systems of the ancient world, mixed with a heavy dose of magic. Egyptian medicine was a strange blend, part science, part superstition. On one hand, they had written medical papyri filled with observations and treatments that sound remarkably modern. On the other hand, a healer might whisper incantations over your wound or smear something questionable on your skin while invoking the gods. Both approaches were seen as equally valid. After all, if your illness wasn't caused by bacteria or injury, it was probably the result of angry spirits or divine punishment. Doctors, called sunu, were highly respected. Some even specialized. There were physicians for the stomach, the eyes, the head, and even the anus. Yes, you could actually visit an ancient proctologist. And since Egypt's hot climate and diet often caused stomach problems, let's just say the poor stomach doctor probably stayed very busy. Treatments often used herbs, minerals, and natural ingredients. Honey was prized as an antiseptic. It could be applied to wounds to prevent infection. Garlic and onions were considered health boosters, thought to strengthen the heart. Willow bark, which contains a chemical similar to aspirin, was given for pain relief. Egyptians might not have known why these remedies worked, but they noticed they did. Of course, not every cure sounds so sensible. Crocodile dung was sometimes applied as a form of birth control. Animal fat might be smeared on wounds, and one remedy for hair loss involved mixing the fat of a hippopotamus, crocodile, and snake, then rubbing it onto the scalp. Whether it grew your hair back or just scared people away is anyone's guess. Surgeries, too, were surprisingly advanced. Doctors could set broken bones with splints, drain abscesses, and stitch wounds. They even practiced basic dentistry, though if you've ever seen an ancient Egyptian skull, you know their teeth were in rough shape. All that gritty bread, filled with sand and stone dust from grinding flour, left mouths worn down to the roots. Toothaches must have been a daily misery. Still, magical spells were never far from medicine. A doctor might recite a charm to banish the evil spirit causing your cough. Healers wore amulets shaped like gods to protect the patient. Some treatments were written on papyrus, dissolved in water, and then drunk, literally swallowing your prescription. Interestingly, women often worked as midwives, healers, and nurses. Birth itself was a mix of medical care and ritual. Expectant mothers squatted on special birthing stools, assisted by midwives. Protective spells were invoked, especially those calling on the goddess Tauret, a hippo-shaped deity believed to safeguard childbirth. Of course, many people didn't live long enough to enjoy old age. Life expectancy hovered around 35 to 40 years. Diseases like tuberculosis, parasites from the Nile, and infections claimed countless lives. Still, compared to many other ancient societies, Egypt's healthcare system was surprisingly effective. Enough so that neighboring civilizations sometimes sent their own patients to Egypt in search of treatment. So, if you were sick in ancient Egypt, you might be given honey and herbs, treated by a surgeon with steady hands, and protected by a whispered spell. It was both practical and mystical, and in its own way it worked. And so, after a very long, very dusty day in ancient Egypt, you've somehow made it through. You've trudged under the scorching sun, stumbled over rough stone streets, wrestled with sand in your bread, and perhaps endured a doctor rubbing crocodile fat on your head. You've bowed to the gods, paid your taxes, and avoided the worst jobs, at least for now. The torches along the narrow mud-brick walls are flickering lower. The markets are closing. The Nile hums in the distance, its water lapping quietly as night spreads its cool relief across the desert. Families gather indoors, curling up on reed mats, letting the faint desert breeze drift through their simple homes. Somewhere in the background, you might hear the faint sound of prayers, the hush of stories being told, or a baby crying softly before finally falling asleep. You're still here, alive but exhausted, and you know that if you were truly an ancient Egyptian, tomorrow would be just as demanding, just as hot, and just as filled with work you never asked for. But tonight you can rest. Tonight you don't have to build pyramids, grind grain into sand-filled flour, or survive another temple tax. Tonight all you need to do is drift. So, let the sounds of the fireplace, or maybe the imagined hush of the Nile, carry you away. Let your eyes grow heavy, your body sink deeper into rest. The world of ancient Egypt will keep turning without you. The pharaoh still reigns, the priests still chant, the The workers still haul stone blocks under the stars. But you can let go now. Close your eyes. Imagine the desert night. Cool, quiet, endless. And simply sleep.